Hello all, welcome, welcome, welcome. We are going to give everyone until about 6:02 to get logged in. So just come on in. At 6:02, we will go ahead and get started. So thank you for your patience. Welcome all, welcome. We give everybody about a 1 more minute or so to get logged in, and then we will go ahead and get started. Hello all, just welcome, welcome. I'm gonna give everybody probably about 30 seconds or so to get all logged in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks for your patience. All righty. Well, hello and welcome to this evening's Zoom webinar that's being produced by the Honors College at West Virginia University. This event is the first honoring diversity lecture taking place this fall semester. These lectures are designed to expose students to a wide variety of content and information they may not necessarily get in their academic courses here at West Virginia University. I am Damian Clement, Associate Dean of the Honors College at West Virginia University. Tonight's lecture is entitled John Brown as Freedom Fighter or Madman, Questions for Abolition, Democracy Today, by Dr. Scott Davidson. Dr. Davidson is the director of the Multidisciplinary Studies program and a professor of philosophy in the Eberly College of Arts and Sciences. We will follow our standard Zoom webinar format this evening. After the presentation, we will host an open question and answer session. Since we are using the Zoom webinar platform for this lecture, before we begin, let me review some of the features that will help you experience this evening's lecture in the best way possible. If you have issues with audio or volume at any point during the webinar, be sure to check your personal Zoom settings and your computer volume controls. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Due to enhanced security protocols, webinar attendees will not be able to see other questions, only their own. To ask a question, you must click on the Q&A button. A separate screen will appear. Then you may type your question. The presenter will answer all your questions at the end of the presentation. If live captioning has been requested, it can be viewed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If live captioning was not requested, a captioned version of this recording will be available at honors.wvu.edu. And now let's get started. So it's my pleasure to turn over the mic and the screen to Dr. Scott Davidson. So Scott, I've stopped my share. You can do your share.
Okay. Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for being here and joining me this evening for the talk. I'd like to thank the Honors College for the invitation, the opportunity to share some of my own interests with you. So this material comes from a course that I teach in philosophy, the social and political philosophy course. And we use the story of John Brown to develop some of the themes in that course. So if this is exciting and interesting to you and you want to learn more, certainly check out that course. in the future. And it's also a topic that's personal to me. As it turns out, I grew up in Kansas, and so in fact, very close to where John Brown was from. Osawatomie Brown is one of the names that he was called. And so I remember as a kid, um, um, older people in my town pointing to particular hills and parts of the area where John Brown would camp out when he was hiding and had gotten in trouble. And we also lived to Lawrence, which he also is known for, I think, burning down. So um, and that links me being here in West Virginia, of course, Harper's Ferry and the trial, the raid on Harper's Ferry and the trial of John Brown are a part of West Virginia history, and really kind of represents in some way my own um, connection with the state and its history. So that's kind of what motivated me in part to bring up this topic, and also then to explore some of the ways in which I think this story, this piece of history is still with us today. Okay, so some of the goals of my talk, I'm going to talk maybe about hopefully just 30 minutes or so, and then leave plenty of time for question and answer, because I'd like to get your take on things and hear what you have to say. So I'm going to take a multidisciplinary approach here and exemplify. I'm director of multidisciplinary studies, and I believe in the power of multidisciplinary approaches, bringing together knowledge from all different kinds of disciplines and tools from those disciplines to provide deeper insight than you can get from any single discipline on its own. So there are elements that I integrate into my talk of art and the analysis of artworks, existentialism from my work in philosophy, but also elements of history and political theory that I'll pull in. And the main thing that I'm going to talk about here is the sense in which John Brown is a weird figure, and he was called weird long before Tim Walz started calling people weird. He was called weird by Herman Melville in the poem "The Portent," which is a series. It was related to a series of poems that Melville wrote about the Civil War, and the portent is looking at the events of the hanging of John Brown as being the portent of the events to come. And so that's in one of the lines, as he said, he refers to him as being weird. And there's also a book that I've used a lot in putting together this talk, whose title is Weird John Brown, and it's one of my favorite books in political philosophy. So if you ever have a chance to read that, I encourage you to do that. It's in our library. Okay, so then I'm going to use this story of John Brown as a parable for abolition democracy movements today and lessons that they might take from his life. So what is abolition democracy in the first place? The broad context. The term originates from Du Bois's book, Black Reconstruction in America, where Du Bois was studying the Reconstruction era immediately after slavery. And he argued that the abolition of slavery was only accomplished negatively with the passage of the 13th Amendment. 13th Amendment abolishes slavery as an institution in the United States after the Civil War. And but the thing that he points out is that the backlash against the 13th Amendment was strong, and that it meant that though slavery was abolished, that didn't translate into a racially just society. And so that's the real goal that we have in mind when he's talking about abolition democracy. He's talking about the goal of creating institutions that remove the vestiges of slavery from themselves. So a prime example, I think, that illustrates what Du Bois is talking about would be the famous Angola prison site, which is literally housed on a former Louisiana plantation, right? And as you can see how the institution of the prison is a sort of stage in the evolution post-slavery. And another sort of institution attached to that was convict leasing, where prisons would sell the labor of prisoners. They were forced into labor on farms. Okay, so Du Bois then here with the notion presenting this idea of abolition democracy, he's envisioning a new set of democratic institutions that need to be created to achieve this goal of racial justice. Right. And so that's kind of the broader sort of, we're going to circle back to this towards the end. Another interesting book just to put out there is this book, The Abolitionist Imagination. I just pull a few passages from that. He talks about abolition and abolition democracy as being a work of the imagination, that it's about envisioning a change that might seem to be impossible, but working towards it anyway. And so it might have seen at the time in which slavery existed as an institution that fighting against it was an impossible battle, that it could never be overcome, right? But then his suggestion is that we ought to channel what we know about history, that it was overcome, to inspire us to imagine more just futures in our own time, even though the changes that we envision may seem difficult or unlikely to be achieved. And who's an abolitionist? As he tells it, it's anyone, whether you're John Brown or whether you're Frederick Douglass or whether you're Du Bois, who identifies an evil and wants to eradicate it, not tomorrow, not next year, but right now, right? And so abolitionists, there's a sort of urgency of the now that is characteristic as he sees it to the abolitionist mindset. And abolitionists oftentimes feel that sense of urgency because they draw their moral clarity from perhaps higher laws, like whether it's divine law or some strongly held conviction and moral principle that they have. It gives them the urgency to eradicate the injustice of the world that they see. Okay, so just a little bit of background. I found when I taught, I was surprised that many of my students didn't know who John Brown was. And so I just want to fill in a little bit of that history. I'm not a historian and I'm not a John Brown scholar, but I will provide a little bit of the context here, but I'm limited in how deep I can go in all of this. So as you are undoubtedly aware, prior to the Civil War, the critical issue that divided North and South had to do with expansion into the Western territories and questions of whether slavery would extend into newly established territories like Kansas or Missouri, which are directly related to these issues and the hotbed of the debate in Brown's own time over this issue. In 1856, Brown, who was a Calvinist, had come to believe that he had a personal duty to overthrow the institution of slavery. And he announced that the time had come to, quote, fight fire with fire, and, quote, strike terror in the hearts of pro-slavery men, right? So he made a decision, and he felt it was a divinely inspired decision to commit violence and impose a cost on the advocates of slavery. Okay, and so some examples of the actions that he took that were inspired by this belief um, was a killing. He participated in a killing of 5 pro-slavery settlers in Kansas in 1856. And so this is one of the famous events um, um, that he participated in. But it's important to know that he wasn't alone. He wasn't the only one committing violence against settlers. His act in 1856 was a response to uh, identical actions that had occurred in Missouri for anti-slavery settlers in Missouri, right, who had been killed by pro-slavery forces there. So his actions aren't occurring in a total vacuum. I think that's important to keep in mind as we move forward. Okay. And so in those years from 56 to 58, he traveled extensively throughout the North, sharing his ideas about the immorality of slavery, speaking with the luminaries of his time, and building a sort of community in the North of people who were working against the institution of slavery and who would be influential in the decades to follow. An example of his commitment to the abolition of slavery was a raid that he conducted in neighboring Missouri, where he freed 11 slaves and then led them to Canada all the way outside of the US. And he envisioned that he would carry out an ongoing sort of guerrilla war against slavery in the Appalachians. And he met in particular with Harriet Tubman to learn more about how to do that in Appalachia. She was well known and knew her way around these areas very well. So, and the idea with the raid of Harper's Ferry, Virginia, was that it was actually a munitions an arsenal, right? So it had a warehouse of weapons. He was going to take over that facility, take the weapons, and then use them to arm slaves to, fuel a slave revolt that would be rooted and mobile, but rooted in Appalachia. But that didn't go quite as planned. The next day, federal troops responded and regained control over Harper's Ferry. Brown and his group was arrested and then put on trial. And Brown would be executed by the state of Virginia on December 2nd, just a little over a month after the raid on Harper's Ferry. So obviously, Brown's actions did not have the intended effect. They did not produce the results of ending the institution of slavery, but the impact that he had was more so with respect to his, rhetoric, so that his words inspired and galvanized anti-slavery forces in the North, and in that way, or a portent of the outbreak of the Civil War. Okay, so he put himself in the line with American revolutionaries. He wrote a new Declaration of Independence that he wanted to use in place of the old one, and set up a constitution in place of the old one, so that it would truly secure the liberty of all and put an end to the institution of slavery once and for all. And there was a view at the time that the Constitution couldn't just be amended to produce a racially just society. Instead, it had to be sort of taken back down to its core and rebuilt. That the institution of slavery was so enmeshed in the Constitution that it made it immoral document, right? And so it needed to be rewritten from the ground up. Okay, so there's a little bit of history, a little sliver of philosophy. So I think there's a really interesting tie in thinking about the violence and the recourse to violence that John Brown has in a response to his understanding of a divine calling, and the response that Kierkegaard, an existentialist philosopher, finds in the biblical figure of Abraham. And in his book, Freedom and Trembling, Kierkegaard describes the strangeness of this biblical story. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but in this telling of the biblical story, God speaks to Abraham and tells him to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham just gets up out of bed, ushers Isaac out of the home, and they climb up to the Mount Moriah, where Abraham is then going to carry out the sacrifice of his son. And then at the last minute, there is a sort of miracle that happens, and a ram appears and is sacrificed instead of the son. But the point that Kierkegaard wants to reflect on and have us reflect on is this strangeness about Abraham, that he was willing to go all the way in response to this voice, this calling that he heard from God. And I think from anybody's ordinary perspective, you would say that would, if you hear a voice and it's telling you to kill your children, you might want to look into that voice, ask some questions about what's going on. But he doesn't. He just proceeds with the mission. And so some might say, well, that's the action of a madman. He is engaging in something that is unethical, that is criminal, and that one should not do, obviously. And only somebody who somebody would only do that if they were mentally unsound, right? And we know of cases where that happens, right? But from another perspective, Abraham is an example of piety, of religious devotion. He places obedience to God above morality, right? He's willing to sacrifice his own son out of his obedience to God and not question it, right? And so in that sense, Abraham's actions aren't below the law, but they're in some ways above the moral law. They respond to a higher calling and perhaps reflect a higher degree of piety than the person who enters into calculations about whether this is the right or wrong course of action. So the question that Kierkegaard ponders and has us ask is, who's the real Abraham? Is he a madman, or is he a knight of faith, in Kierkegaard's own words? And Kierkegaard turns this over again and again in Fear and Trembling, and it's really quite remarkable. And in the end, he comes to the idea that, for us, Abraham is incomprehensible. We can't make sense of him. And so he would count as, in the sense that we're using it, somebody who is weird, right? He doesn't fit our ordinary categories, hard to classify. The same weirdness, I want to suggest, can be seen in the conflicts over how we should interpret the actions of John Brown. Right? So is he a freedom fighter, or is he a madman? Some people embraced Brown's actions and saw him as a freedom fighter. Somebody who's working on the side of justice. For example, Frederick Douglass saw the work of Reconstruction after the Civil War as a continuation of Brown's legacy. W.E.B. Du Bois founded his Niagara movement at Harper's Ferry to link it to Brown's legacy. Eugene Debs, famous person working for workers' rights, called for somebody to step up and be a John Brown to end wage slavery. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that Brown was a new saint, and when he hangs, we'll make the gallows glorious like the cross. So he sees him as a sort of religious icon in his willing to commit everything to the eradication of injustice. Thoreau described John Brown as the most American of us all, right? So a true American. Conversely, many others saw him as a dangerous fanatic, both in the North and in the South. So those who had previously supported him in the North denounced his actions at Harper's Ferry, denounced his use of violence. Others at the time did so as well from the side of the South, right? That he was sowing chaos and disorder. There's a night, and this line of interpretation about John Brown as a madman or as a fanatic continues on in popular culture long after the Civil War. So, for example, there's a film called The Santa Fe Trail, which is about John Brown, and there he's cast as a homicidal maniac. So he's seen as a fanatic who has to be hung, has to be punished in order to maintain law and order, right? And so this is sort of the other competing interpretation of him. And I think here I want to show you the most prominent example where I think you can see this interpretation take hold, right? So when people think about John Brown, they think about this image, right? And John Brown here does not look like so much a freedom fighter as he does a fanatic. And this is the image produced by John Stuart Coury, and it's displayed on the Kansas State Capitol, the wall. It's a large fresco. Okay, and if you analyze the painting, what you see is a whole lot of natural disaster in the background: tornadoes, wildfires, smoke, turmoil, right? Things are getting burned down, destroyed, right? Destruction in the background. You see settlers, you see the covered wagons, people walking alongside them into these new Western states. Okay. And then you also see, of course, on each side, you see the flag of the U.S. flag and the Confederate flag, people pointing guns at one another, fallen soldiers at the feet of John Brown. You see Brown himself. Look at the weapons carried in, at his side in holsters. Look at the rifle in his right arm. Look at the Bible in the other, saying the Alpha and the Omega, right? Beginning and the end. And then John Brown's crazed eyes right at the center, right? And the beard, flowing like, itself, sort of reminding you of the chaos in the background being blown by the wind of a tornado or the fire. Okay, so this sort of iconography of Brown um, uh, depicts bleeding Kansas and the struggle over the institution of slavery. And Curry himself wrote about the fresco that I portray John Brown as a bloodthirsty, God-fearing maniac. Okay, so he actively embraces the fanatic interpretation of Brown. Okay, and these are just underscoring those points I just talked you through. Okay, so we're getting close. The trial, then, the trial, they have to decide who is John Brown, right? They have to decide, is he a criminal? Is he devout, right? Should he be allowed to go free? Is he a criminal? Should he be punished? Or is he a madman? Should he be treated not as a criminal, but as mentally unfit, insane, right? Those are the three options on the table as his case goes to trial. And one thing that's fascinating about this case is that it really is maybe the first sort of nationwide trial, right? So the rise of the telegraph and the ability to communicate, instantaneously what is going on, what is happening at the trial. This was a new technology and a new phenomenon that hadn't happened before, where you would have national attention on a single court case at the time when it was happening. So in this time between the raid on Harper's Ferry in October, mid-October, and his execution in December, there was intense scrutiny of the whole thing and coverage of it by the press, right? So it was like what we know now in a very familiar way, like the sensational, nationwide trial that captures everybody's attention. So as it turns out, the trials known as Virginia versus Brown was carried out by the Commonwealth of Virginia. Virginia Governor Henry Wise secured jurisdiction over the case. He wanted to try it as a Virginia case rather than a federal case, though Harper's Ferry was a federal arsenal. So the state brought 3 charges against Brown: treason against the state, first-degree murder, and incitements of slaves to rebellion. Okay, the trial took place in Charlestown, just right next to Harper's Ferry, and it lasted a little more than a week. And as a result of it, Brown was convicted and sentenced to hang. And other trials followed suit of the other members of Brown's raiding party. So it's interesting that Brown actually, he did not allow his lawyers to argue insanity. He wasn't willing to accept that as a defense. He presented it as a principled use of violence, as a lawful use of violence against an unlawful institution. And he became well known and famous for copies of his speech after sentencing were published across America and read. Right? And and some people, they called it sort of they consider it to be the second best written thing after the Declaration of Independence, right? So that was his opportunity, again, to use rhetoric to persuade people to his side. So though he used violence and was convicted for the violence that he used, he was also making a broader appeal to the general public about the immorality of slavery, right? And so his actions failed quite miserably on one level, but his rhetoric prevailed on another, right? That he was successfully able to help galvanize the North to take up violence against the institution of slavery, against its injustice. And here's a picture of, so the governor of Virginia was, I guess you would say, extremely paranoid about some militias or groups of people coming to free Brown and the others. And so they stationed more than 1,000 troops in the town of Charlestown. More than 1,000 are here surrounding the gallows and his execution, right? Or his hanging. Quite the event in a small town. And he says in his final words before he is hanged that I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed, it might be done, right? So there's a lot of religious language here, actually, like guilt, purging, blood, sacrifice, these sort of things, right? But again, so I think the Melville poem captures it well. John Brown is portending things to come, right? Seeing into a future. And in this way, Du Bois's interpretation of him is a little bit different. He sees Brown as a martyr of sorts. So I'll just read this speech that he gave at Harper's Ferry in 1932, launching the Niagara movement. It says, some people have the idea that crucifixion consists in the punishment of an innocent man. The essence of crucifixion is that men are killing a criminal, that men have got to kill him and yet that the act of crucifying him is the salvation of the world. John Brown broke the law. He killed human beings. Those people who defended slavery had to execute John Brown, although they knew that in killing him, they were committing the greater crime. It is out of that human paradox that there comes crucifixion. Okay, so for Du Bois, you might say Brown becomes a sacrificial figure like John the Baptist in the Bible. John the Baptist is a sort of a precursor to Jesus. He is beheaded. So he's there to accomplish, uh, the same things as Jesus wanted to accomplish, but he fails. And you could then look at the parallel here. I think what Du Bois is getting at is a parallel with the figure of Jesus. Just as John the Baptist is a prefiguring of Jesus and the crucifixion of Jesus, which has a salvation effect in the biblical telling. So too, we can see here historically in America that John Brown is a precursor, right? He engages in violence, fails, and is killed for it, right? But his death prefigures another death, and that will be the death of Abraham Lincoln, right? Abraham Lincoln carries out the war, ending the institution of slavery, and is assassinated, right? But his assassination, then, what Du Bois is saying, is like he's a Christ-like figure, right, in bringing the salvation of America in the overcoming of the institution of slavery. And so that's maybe where we should end it. And I'll talk a little bit about, I think, the big lesson of John Brown and his place in American history. I'm going to end it with just this broader question about how he might instruct abolition movements today. Okay. What we can learn from him. These are just a few suggestions I'll throw out there. Prepare for the conflict of interpretations. Every movement of progress is followed by a backlash. Radical change is a threat to status quo, right? So if you're advocating for change, if you're advocating for social justice, you may be a hero to some, but you will be a villain to others. You will be a madman, villainized. Get ready for it. Beware of your allies. They will stand with you until they meet resistance. This was the case for many Northerners who supported Brown and later disavowed his actions. Be a better ally. Don't just stand around. Commit to what you're standing for. People don't need allies just to stand around them. They need allies to stand for them, to stand with them. Know what you're standing for. And lastly, have the courage, going back to the abolitionist imaginary, have the courage to imagine a future, even if it doesn't seem possible or likely that you will be able to achieve it. It still is worth imagining a more just future. I'll leave it there. I'll look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Scott. That was awesome. So if you can unshare your screen and let's see, let's get some questions, folks. Let's see here. Okay, I got one here. Um, do you think John Brown would have been so significant a figure if he wasn't executed and elevated to martyrdom? Would the climb of abolitionist ideals have been so sharp in the North? Great question.
That is an excellent question. No, I don't think he would have been as effective. This is a sort of paradox, right? I His execution made his fame. It made his legend, and that was his victory, not his defeat, in fact, right? He won because he was the execution of him. It gave him this media attention, the ability to send his message broadly across the nation. So it produced far greater impact than anything else he could have done. And I think we see that maybe in other cases as well, right? With martyrdom, right? Where somebody dies for a cause, we think we're ending it by making a problem go away, right? If we get rid of John Brown, we'll get rid of the challenge to slavery, right? If we get rid of Socrates, we'll kill him. We'll get people to stop asking questions. It doesn't work that way. You can't make a problem go away by simply hiding it or making people disappear who are talking about it. The problem is still there.
Nice. Why do you think so few people know about John Brown and other abolitionists now?
That is a good question. I don't know the answer to, but I think it's a really important um, story. I will say I'm not somebody who is in favor of the use of violence. And so I don't agree with his use of violence. So, but I think his actions and his story do raise that question for us, right? When, if ever, is violence justified, right? Political forms of violence, when, if ever, is we need to ask that question, reflect on it. There's a great talk. I'll just put in a plug this coming Wednesday, the Gandhi King lecture at 4 o'clock. There's a Zoom link and also will be in the Mountain Lair if you want to attend in person which is actually on the day, I believe, of Gandhi's birthday.
Okay, cool. Here, I feel like this is a statement, not really sure if it's a question, but let me read it. So, history was written by the victors who say that some of these other radical movements inspired by Brown were led by crazy people? Guess it's a question.
Okay.
I'm not, I'm not sure. Okay. How do biases reporting of the trial of John Brown from the era influence our modern perception?
Tremendously. I think maybe these two questions are kind of asking the same
Yeah, they're
thing,
getting at
right? That history, what happened in history, the events of history are continually being disputed and reinterpreted in the future, right? And so John Brown's image, it opens up in these different directions, like I was talking about. Like either he's a hero to some, an inspiration to some, and for others, he's a scourge. He is exactly, the problem. He produced this terrible devastation and destruction, right? Um, and so what's interesting is just to look at like how does he get represented in these different ways in culture at what times, what eras interpret him one way, what eras interpret him in another way, and how does that take hold? And why does that take hold in a given time, right? What work is that doing?
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, easy one. What philosophy class do you teach about John Brown in?
It's the social and political philosophy.
Okay. What are some figures in the modern era who you would consider similar to John Brown, if there are any?
Ooh, this is a good one. I want to turn that back on the person asking the question, like where do they see similarities? Where do they, who is like John Brown? Do we have a figure like that?
Let's see if they answer.
But I think the spirit, you do have abolitionist movements today, right? So they're trying to eliminate abolition, or they're trying to eliminate the vestiges of slavery, of racial inequality in its institutional forms today, whether that's in, reforming the prison system, reforming labor conditions, so much. So those people doing that kind of work are in that sense, they're tied to the same cause. They're at different points in history, but they're working on the same project over time, right? So the task today is not to overturn, I think, the United States government, right? But the task for us today is a little bit different. Is to look at, with respect to voting rights, right? How might voting rights and laws shaped dealing with voting rights, how might they be changed to be more racially just? And how might, in their present form, they replicate certain aspects of depriving people to vote? Those sorts of questions. People doing that kind of work, they are in community with the abolitionists of the past.
Okay, here's a really good one. You mentioned that the two most common interpretations of John Brown are that of a martyr and a hopeless fanatic. Do you think there could be a third modern interpretation that portrays John Brown as the one person brave enough to take action and really kickstart the abolitionist movement aside from the violence?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Most definitely. I think that's tied to his martyrdom, though, for me. Right. That he has this principle, and he's willing to sacrifice everything, even his life, the life of his son. His sons die in these raids. He sacrifices everything for that principle. Right. But I agree with you. What we should take. We might not be so extreme in our methods, but we should, I think, take from this a willingness to act, not just to see something going wrong, but to act on it, right? And have the courage to do that, because it does take courage.
How do you think John Brown shaped abolitionist ideas after his death? Do you think people became inspired by his action, or do you think it pushed people away from the cause? For example, how John Brown shaped Martin Luther King Jr. versus Malcolm X's different
Ah,
ideas.
yeah, you're right. You're right. So it has that dual, it doesn't just have one effect,
Yeah.
right? Um, but certainly, um, uh, yeah, Malcolm X like saw himself as linked to John Brown, right? And it was his embrace of violent struggle. Um, uh, that was part of that link. And I think in Brown's own time, there was a sort of split here between those who saw violence as not being the answer versus those who saw um, um, violence as an unfortunate inevitability. That the system of, don't forget, don't let it leave your mind that the institution of slavery was itself inherently violent, right? Not just in depriving people of liberty, but in the actual treatment of enslaved people.
Someone makes a statement here. I'm not sure if it's modern, but Malcolm X. And I think that's probably a follow-up to one of the questions that we had asked
Mhm.
before. Um, is abolition democracy still wrong? If so, what institutions does it target?
Ah, yeah. So there's actually Angela Davis is a great example. She has a book called Abolition Democracy. You can check it out. We read it in my class. It's just some interviews, but certainly her work with the prison system is one prime example of abolition democracy. So a lot of people looking to sort of whether it's working against the death penalty or working, for really significant prison reform. That's the kind of work that abolition democracy does. Yeah, and so there are a lot of people who um, um, who do this kind of work these days and call themselves abolitionists, linking themselves to the abolition movement of pre-Civil War times.
Okay. What do you believe is the most important takeaway from the actions of John Brown?
Like I said, I think it's for us as ordinary citizens, it's simply from John Brown himself, it's probably the willingness to act in the face of injustice. For me personally, I think the more important takeaway is maybe this broader question about in the face of injustice, what should we do? How should we act? Right. And again, like whether you embrace Brown's actions as inevitable or whether you say that he should have taken another side. I think that's the type of question that's most significant for us today, right?
Okay.
What is the best way to achieve social change that's lasting?
Okay. Here's a good one here, I think. Are there other people like John Brown that we may not know from a historical perspective that would be beneficial for us to learn more about?
Oh, I'm sure there are. No doubt. But that's a great question, right? And that's kind of the work that we all ought to be doing is as a researcher, what are the untold stories here? We know the wide told tales, but what are the smaller, more local stories that don't get the same kind of attention, but have the same kind of issues running through them? Yeah, so I think that's a really brilliant question to take away from tonight, right? What can I learn?
Mhm.
What stories can I find?
Let's close up here on this might be our final one. Do you believe that Brown's raid was more effective in leaving an imprint on history because of the violence he inflicted?
Well, certainly, I think it wasn't his violence, but maybe the state's violence against him that was had the greatest impact. Don't forget that Brown had been going and many others were going around preaching for abolition and meeting and organizing together to raise funds to support abolitionist causes, to challenge the institution of slavery. But really, I think the big player here was the hanging of John. There was the trial and condemning him to death. That's what I think turned the tides, right? That's what got people's attention. That was the alarm that was sounded.
Okay. Well, Scott, thank you so very much. We really appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this evening. Attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Davison. His email is sdavidso@mail.wvu.edu. An archived version of this webinar will be available later on the Honors College website. Thank you for spending this time with us, and everyone have a good night. Scott,
Thank you,
this was awesome.
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
very
you.
much, everyone. Everyone have a good evening.
All right. Take care.
Yep. Bye-bye.